This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
The idea here is that I think Bunyan is changing it from, this is not just it happened because of haste, but it happened because of his counsel. This was a deliberative move on Christians' part to say, hey, that path looks easier.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing well and looking forward to getting back on the pilgrimage that we've been on.
We are back in our Pilgrim's Progress walkthrough, and as always, for that, we're joined by our Pilgrim's Progress expert, Jeff Stivason. Jeff is the pastor of Grace Presbyterian Church in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania, and a professor at Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. And he has been our guide on this pilgrimage. So, Jeff, thanks for joining us again today.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you guys. Thanks for having me again.
Now, when we left off in the account of Pilgrim's Progress, there was a great flood, and we stopped just before their meeting with giant despair. And the text tells us that they meet giant despair and cannot argue with him, for they knew themselves in a fault. So, Jeff, outline for us giant despair and what happens there and what we learn.
Yeah, this is one of those great places in the Pilgrim's Progress. I mean, it's so rich with imagery, and I think one of the reasons why I like this section of the story so well is because it's so real. Bunyan is not dodging the difficult questions. He takes on depression and not just depression light. He takes on depression at a serious level. Our main character is thinking about taking his own life, and there are a number of ways that he helps us to understand that. But one of the ways, and I'll just let me peek ahead just for a minute, but one of the ways is that he says in this story, he says, the grave is more easy for me than this dungeon. In other words, it's easier for me to die than it is for me to stay in this depressive state. And if you remember all the way back to the very beginning, the thing he was worried about in the city of destruction was being pulled down to the grave. And then after he left, he told Pliable and Obstinate, he says to them, you guys will go down to the grave. Like I'm not there anymore. You guys will. And now all of a sudden we find in this place in the progress that giant despair has gotten hold of him. And he actually thinks that it would be better to go down to the grave than to be in this depressive dungeon. So I love it because I think it's one of those places where Bunyan is just so real, so where we are as a church today and what we need to hear.
Jeff, can we talk a little bit about the sense of guilt that they have? Giant despair lays hold of them for trespassing on his land, and that statement that Jonathan read, they knew themselves to be in a fault. They could answer him little because they knew themselves to be in a fault. And so Bunyan is not saying, hey, you're not really that bad. You're not really guilty. In fact, they knew themselves to be in fact guilty. And so This is it's a trespass. They've wandered. We talked last time. They wandered out of the way. They went into Bypath Meadow. The floods overtook them, and they could not find their way back. And they all, I don't know if this is inevitable. Do they inevitably end up, if we do this as Christians, if we don't find a way back right away, do we inevitably, probably almost inevitably, find ourselves on the grounds of giant despair? This is sort of like where you almost have to end up if you go into Bypath Meadow and lose your way.
Yeah, you don't want to be necessarily mechanistic about it because you want to leave room for the Spirit of God to work in wonderful ways in one's life and sort of, almost take you out of a situation, as in some ways he does, in this castle. But you're right. There is a sense in which if you are walking in these paths in your mind, if you're thinking these kinds of thoughts, and if you're doing things that take you out of the way, then you can expect consequences. You can expect a certain path to open up before you. And he talks about, now in this place, Christian had double sorrow. This is one of the interesting things about the text that we're using, the banner text, and the pulley text that I referenced earlier. Let me read. I'm going to read from the pulley text and then make the difference. The pulley text says right after that sentence about double sorrow. Now, in this place, Christian had double sorrow because 'twas through his unadvised counsel that they were brought into this distress. The banner text says, "'Twas through his unadvised haste that they were brought into this distress." And the pulley text is the last text that was printed in Bunyan's lifetime. Other texts. Well, there are a number of other texts, but depending on which text, it may be an earlier text that he changed, maybe a later text that, for instance, like the Roger Sharrock text, that's a critical edition that sort of never existed in Bunyan's lifetime, and so on. But the idea here is that I think Bunyan is changing it from, this is not just it happened because of haste, but it happened because of his counsel. This was a deliberative move on Christian's part to say, "Hey, that path looks easier," and we heard that voice, and that voice, remember, without examination, that voice is a trustworthy voice, although that voice was named Vainglory and so on. So there's that. There is a sense in which if you move in this direction, you can expect these kinds of consequences, these kinds of things on your new path to open up.
So Christian, in other words, is saying he's suffering the sorrow from being in that situation, which is so difficult for him. He thinks death would be preferable, and he also realizes essentially it is my fault.
Yeah.
This is my own fault.
Yeah, the interesting thing, you're right, it's at 100%. And the interesting thing is that shift from haste to counsel is interesting, because what Bunyan then does is he talks about diffidence's counsel. The giant's wife, who diffidence is obviously no faith, or lacking in faith, and so this no faith wife of the giants is offering counsel to her husband so that he can continue to heap guilt upon them, and despair upon them in the midst of it. So it's a good shift, I think. In other words, I think Bunyan has made a helpful shift in getting us to see that there's a cognitive element to our despair that we need to bring into view. What we think matters in the midst of this. And we can tell ourselves lies. We can make excuses. I think they went in haste is somewhat of an excuse. Or they can tell themselves true things and counteract those untrue things that are being said to them from wherever direction.
Now, this is the role that Hopeful plays, because Hopeful speaks to Christians' thoughts of suicide and speaks of others who have been in that situation before and have been lifted out of it. So how does Hopeful, you mentioned the fact that how we think and telling ourselves lies is one direction we need to consider, but Hopeful here really does try to speak the truth to Christian, and it's a power. There are some powerful truths there.
Yeah, yeah, and it's it's one of those things that I think that we have to keep in mind that, you know, Bunyan is increasingly wanting us to understand that Christian is isolating himself, and he's continually he's I think that he's wanting us to see that here's a voice speaking truth, but but Christian is continually not hearing that truth. For instance, there's another textual interesting point on page 135. Um, uh, Hopeful says in the middle of his statement, "Thou seest that I'm in the dungeon with thee, a far weaker man by nature than thou art. Also, this giant has wounded me as well as thee, and hath also cut off the bread and water from my mouth. And with thee I mourn without the light." Uh, Pulley has, and with that I mourn without the light. In other words, I think that what he's helping us to see is that hopeful is choosing to see himself with Christian and with the things that provide him with hope. And what are the things that provide him with hope? Well, things like the Lord himself, who may deliver them. Um, Thinking about the law of God, what does the written word say? Or the providential hand of God could remove us from this situation in the blink of an eye. And so here you have, Christian sort of saying, it's better for me to go to the grave. I'm alone in this. I can't even see my friend. And his friend is basically saying to him, I could choose to see myself alone, but I don't. I see myself with you, and I see all of these other helps that are around me that I need to avail myself of, that you need to avail yourself of. And I think one of the things I think that Bunyan does a great job of is helping us to see that there's a fellowship aspect of this that we need to keep in mind. For instance, at the very start of this, he says they didn't have a bit of bread or a drop of drink or light, and you think to yourself, those are things that constitute fellowship. Bread and drink are usually what help us to gather around the table. And then he goes on and it says, and they were far from friends and acquaintances. In other words, I think he helps us with the link of bread and wine, bread and water, or whatever. Like, fellowship is gone in this castle. And so when fellowship is gone, hopeful is the only residue of that fellowship. And he's working hard to pull Christian into that sense of being with him in the midst of that terrible situation. And I would just say this to you, and I know I'm rattling on, but one of the things that I have loved about John Newton is that John Newton wrote the only hymns with I can't remember the guy's name, but the guy was depressed.
William Cooper.
William Cooper, and Newton um, did that project in order to be with Cooper, and I'll never forget that. I thought that was just an excellent pastoral move that mirrored Hopeful and Christian at this point.
There's a point where Hopeful casts Christian's mind back on his previous victories.
Yeah.
Times when he'd faced adversity, some even more seemingly difficult than what he was currently facing. What is the value of that, Jeff? I mean, in our lives, are we to, there's a sense in which we need to forget what lies behind and press forward to what lies ahead. And certainly that's kind of the guiding theme throughout most of Pilgrim's Progress. The word progress is in the title. There's a kind of onwardness about it.
Yeah.
But is the onwardness helped by a kind of sanctified backward looking. I guess I want to put it that way. How are we supposed to go about that? Is that something we should be doing?
Yeah, and I think that's a valuable insight into this section of text. In fact, I think that Bunyan is wanting us to see that hopeful is actually taking his mind back to um, better days, but Bunyan wants to make the connection pretty solid for us. So if you go back to Vanity Fair, um, Hopeful is reminding Christian of the patience that he exercised in the cage back then, and so Bunyan makes a clear linguistic link to that time, and he uses hopeful in order to help us to see that link. So I think Bunyan is saying that we say past victories are not to be relied upon. Well, there's a sense in which that's true, but past victories are not to be forgotten either, because they do provide us with evidence that the Lord has worked in our lives and that there has been progress up to this point. And I think that that's a good thing. And I think that's one of those, I think it's one of those things that's helpful for us to do when we have a brother or sister who's struggling with something like this, to remind them that this is where you were at one time. And we're doing that because we want them to see that God has worked in their lives, not so that we can see how great they are.
There's something like this in Isaiah where he's in the face of like the threat of Babylon. He's casting their mind back on their deliverances from Assyria, and saying, as it was then, so God doesn't lose, basically. And here's let's go over some of the past victories.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that there are a number of things in here, that are great, and I know we wanted to transfer to the promise at the end, and I want to make sure that we have time to talk about that. But the thing that's interesting about this section is that you can tell that the castle's dark and the giant loves darkness. And there's something about the giant that, when he encounters sunshine, he loses the ability to use his hand. Our text says he loses the ability to use his hand. Interestingly, the pulley text says hands. The hands is plural there. I wonder if Bunyan wanted that slight addition to help us to understand there's a debilitation of the whole man, right? And of the whole of despair. And I think that when you think about that, sunshine then becomes something of the promise, because when you open up to where they are, um, you notice that daybreak is mentioned, that they're going to wait for daybreak, and then daybreak is not mentioned at all um, in the rest of the narrative until you get it's Wednesday when they get into the woods, and they're laying down and they're sleeping, and then it's late Saturday night, early Sunday morning when the promise breaks through. Now a little before it was day, uh, good Christian, as one half amazed, break it out into his passionate speech, and remembers that he's got the promise, the key of promise around his neck. So it's interesting that the promise is equated with the daybreak. Also, there's the resurrection theme there as well, but it's fascinating to me that the light that shines on despair, that debilitates despair, is the promise of God. I think that's wonderful.
Hmm.
And
Well, as you mentioned, Jeff, he has this key, and it has been around his neck the whole time.
yeah,
And that's a significant detail, and sheds significant light onto what Bunyan wants to say about those who are in the state of despair and doubt. And so let's finish with that. The key that Christian has possessed the whole time?
Yeah, that promise is simply a word. And I think that in our, and maybe it's been true for a long time, but I think when you think about how we oftentimes think about words, we oftentimes, for instance, when you say to someone, you express to someone your love for them, you feel as if the words you're saying aren't quite capturing what's in you for that person. And you say, I wish I could do more than just say these words. And I've been brought up short a number of times to remember that it's God who revealed himself in a word and said right to the Israelites, you didn't see anything, you heard a word. And I need to continually remind myself, maybe as a modern, postmodern kind of person, that words matter, and they're not just signs that can mean anything. Words matter, because God spoke these words to us, and there's meaning behind them. And so, the idea that a promise is spoken to us and that it is light that enters into our depression is something that I think requires us to shift in our thinking. And especially, I think the person who's feeling depressed, they need to remember that what I'm thinking and the darkness that's kind of shrouding you know, uh, my life right now is a lie, and that I need to listen to the truth. It's funny how these things happen, isn't it? I can remember back to the time when my brother was murdered. I remember my mom just not opening the curtains, and you'd go down to her house, and like the house was just dark. And my dad would come home from work, and the house would be dark, and he would just throw open the curtains, and I remember talking to him about that, and he said, it's just when the light comes in, it's just like there's a different attitude and just a different tenor that takes hold, and you who want to be in the darkness perhaps must respond to that light. You can't help but respond to that light. And I think that the Christian is like that with the promise of God. The Christian will ultimately respond to that promise, because they are drawn to that light, which is His Word. I guess I want to say one thing to you guys too, and we can, um, I think what we have to keep in mind is sometimes we treat suicide and depression today as if it's an inevitable consequence, in other words, as if the Christian can be taken hold of by this monster of depression and be forced to take their own life against their will. And I think that that's the picture that the world has painted for us of depression, that it's greater than the gospel of grace. And I actually had a young person, who went to a funeral, Christian funeral, where the minister basically said that this person who had taken their life had been, kind of held by a monster against their will, and did this terrible thing to themselves, but what, kind of did it against their will, and came to me and said, I'm afraid that that might happen to me. I'm afraid that I might be taken hold of by that monster, if I can just continue to use that language. And I think that what we need to say is Bunyan is telling us a different story based on the Word of God, and that is that depression is not a monster that can do with us anything it will. Depression is something that can be broken, and that brokenness can come through the Word of God.
Well, Jeff, on that note, hopeful note, really, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world, we will pause our Pilgrim's Progress series until next time. But Jeff, thank you as always for joining us and for guiding us through this great work.
Yeah, always a pleasure to be here and to talk about this book. Thanks for having me.
This is part 9 of our Pilgrim's Progress series. And if any of you would like to enter to win a copy of the Banner of Truth edition of the Pilgrim's Progress, you can do that at theologyonthego.org or at placefortruth.org, clicking on the Theology on the Go link. If you know someone who might be helped by this episode, please pass it along. And if you can rate and review the podcast, that helps us spread the word. So please do that. It just takes a minute of your time. And if you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or at placefortruth.org. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.